Welcome to Nikki's Nightmares, where chilling tales come to life. In today's terrifying story, we descend into the isolated world of long-haul trucking, where endless highways, desolate backroads, and forgotten rest stops become the setting for encounters that defy explanation. From a wall of unnatural fog on Highway 265, where a child's cry turns into something far more sinister, to violent midnight knocks beside a snow-buried cemetery, to a hitchhiker who had already died hours before asking for a ride, these true trucker horror stories blur the line between exhaustion and the paranormal. Headlights cut through darkness, CB radios fall silent, and something unseen lingers just beyond the windshield, waiting. If you love scary stories, paranormal encounters, and true horror experiences, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join me as we delve into the deep, dark, and the mysterious. Being a truck driver means long hours, endless miles, a ribbon of asphalt stretching into darkness with no promise of company and no guarantee of light. It is work that demands stamina, steady hands on the wheel, sharp eyes scanning the horizon, and a mind alert enough to battle fatigue at 3 a.m. The road is supposed to be predictable. Engines hum, tires whisper against pavement. Headlights carve twin tunnels through the night. Mile markers pass in quiet succession. Weather changes. Traffic slows. These are the challenges drivers are trained to face. But not everything encountered on the highway can be explained by black ice or heavy fog or poor visibility. For some long-haul truckers, the journey has shifted from routine to something far more unsettling. Highways are often imagined as open and expansive, freedom in its purest form, yet the truth is more isolating. Cabins become cubicles, radios crackle with distant voices that fade into static, and the desolate backroads of the country transform into lonely corridors where help can be hours away. Truckers go where others don't. They drive through abandoned stretches of desert where cell service disappears without warning. They wind through forests where tree lines swallow moonlight whole. They pass shuttered towns that seem frozen in time, gas stations that flicker, rest stops that sit too quiet. And sometimes they see things. A figure standing on the shoulder of the highway miles from the nearest exit. A hitchhiker who vanishes from the rearview mirror. A child in white illuminated by headlights, only to disappear before the brakes can even engage. Shapes that run alongside the rig at impossible speeds. Silhouettes reflected in mirrors where no car follows. Voices over the CB radio that do not belong to anyone logged into the channel. Most truckers will tell you the road has its own personality, that certain stretches of highway feel wrong, heavy, as if something unseen watches from the tree line, as if the darkness itself presses too close against the windshield. They are the pioneers of the modern frontier, navigating the arteries of the country while the rest of the world sleeps. And in that sleeping world, strange things move. We raise a chilling tribute to the men and women who keep driving, even after something unexplainable crosses their path. Stories whispered over truck stop coffee, confessions shared only after engines are turned off and doors are locked. The fog on 265. A few years ago, I was driving for Costco during the holiday rush. Around this time of year, we always hauled extra toy shipments to different locations because stores couldn't keep up with demand. One night, we got a call that a rural Kentucky store needed to restock their giant Spider-Man dolls. They were the oversized ones, the kind that take up half a pallet. Because I had a reputation for moving quickly and getting deliveries done ahead of schedule, I was assigned the last-minute late-night run. I loaded up the truck and headed out on 265, expecting nothing more than a quiet drive. It was close to 3 a.m. when I started to feel uneasy. At first, I dismissed it as simple fatigue. Driving alone in the early morning hours can play tricks on your mind. The road was empty, the sky was dark, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of the engine. I told myself I was just tired and took a couple of no-dos to stay sharp. About 15 minutes later, the fog began rolling in. At first it was light, something manageable. Then it thickened rapidly. Within minutes it became the densest fog I had ever driven through. My high beams reflected back at me, and visibility dropped so low that I could barely see beyond the hood of my truck. It felt like I was driving into a solid wall of white. Not wanting to risk an accident, I pulled off to the side of the highway to wait it out. There were no other cars on the road, no headlights in either direction, and I was ahead of schedule anyway. I figured I would sit for a few minutes and let it clear. I had been sitting there in silence for about 5 minutes when my truck suddenly died. The engine shut off without warning. The dashboard lights went black. The headlights cut out. It wasn't like a stall or a mechanical struggle. Everything simply stopped at once. I tried turning the key. Nothing happened. I reached for the CB radio and tried to get anyone on the line. All I got back was dead air. I checked my cell phone, hoping at least to call for roadside assistance, but there was no signal. As I sat there thinking through my options, I began to hear something outside. At first, it sounded like a child crying. The sound was faint, but clear enough to make out. It didn't echo the way you'd expect on an open highway. It sounded close, as if it were just beyond the fog. Then the crying changed. It deepened and shifted into what sounded like a grown woman sobbing. The tone was heavy and deliberate, not frantic, not panicked, just steady, mournful crying. I'm a big guy, 6'3", about 250 pounds, and I'm not easily rattled. But I had no intention of stepping out into that fog. Instead, I rolled my window down a few inches and called out, asking if anyone needed help. The crying stopped immediately. It didn't fade or trail off. It stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. Before I could even process that, I heard something else. It was a laugh, low at first, then sharper. It wasn't loud in a theatrical way, but it carried clearly through the fog. There was something deliberate about it, something that made it feel directed at me specifically. I quickly rolled my window back up. As I sat there, I had the distinct sense that the more afraid I became, the more intense that laughter grew. It seemed to circle the truck, though I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter stopped. In that same moment, my dashboard lights flickered back on. The engine turned over as if nothing had ever been wrong. The headlights cut through the fog, and the fog itself began to thin. Within moments, visibility improved enough for me to safely get back on the road. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out and drove straight to the next truck stop without looking back. When I arrived, I parked and went inside immediately. I headed to the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at myself in the mirror. I kept asking the same question over and over. Did that really just happen? I still don't have an explanation for what I heard that night. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the fog distorted distant sounds in ways I didn't understand. But I have driven thousands of miles since then, through storms, through heavy fog, through the quietest stretches of highway imaginable. And I have never experienced anything like that again. Whatever was out there on 265 that night, it knew I was listening. The Midnight Knocker. It was years ago, one of those winter runs up through rural New York State. I had delivered to a Walmart distribution center tucked away in some forgotten little town out in the boonies. It was past midnight by the time I finished the drop and hook, and my clock was almost completely burned up. I didn't have many options. Snow was coming down hard. Not a light flurry, but one of those thick, relentless storms they get up there. The kind that swallows sound, the kind that makes the world feel smaller. I asked the guard shack if there were any truck stops nearby. He laughed, just shook his head, said no, but he told me about a wide pull-off just outside of town along a 2-lane state highway. Said trucks parked there all the time to take their breaks. Sure enough, a few miles down the road, there it was, a big open spot about 20 feet off the pavement. No lights, no buildings, just darkness and snow. I pulled in, shut down the truck, and climbed into the sleeper. I ran an electric blanket in the winter, and even with the storm, it wasn't brutally cold, just quiet. The wind pushed snow against the cab in steady waves, and the sound of it hitting the metal was almost soothing. I stripped down, slid under the sleeping bag, and let that heavy, exhausted comfort settle over me. I was right on the edge of sleep when it happened. 3 loud, violent bangs on the driver's door. It sounded exactly like a cop knocking, hard enough to rattle the whole cab. I shot upright, heart pounding, already irritated. The last thing I needed was a ticket or some county deputy telling me I had to move. I threw my clothes back on, pulled the curtain aside, and climbed into the driver's seat. There was nothing there. No flashing lights, no headlights, no passing traffic, just snow, falling thick and silent under the beam of my marker lights. I sat there longer than I cared to admit, staring into the storm, waiting for someone to step out of the dark. No one did. Eventually, I laid back down, but I didn't undress again. I left the curtains open this time. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard it. A scraping sound along the side of the cab, slow, dragging. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my maglite and the claw hammer I kept in the truck and jumped out into the snow. The beam cut across the trailer, the tires, the ground. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, no sound except the wind. I walked the driver's side first, then around the trailer. It was empty, so I wasn't worried about anyone breaking in. When I came back around the passenger side, I looked up and saw tree limbs hanging above the truck. In the dark, they looked close enough to touch the cab. That had to be it, I told myself. Wind pushing branches against the truck. Made sense. I climbed back in, started the engine this time, bumped up the idle, and turned every exterior light on. If someone was messing with me, I figured a fully lit running truck would discourage it. Locked the doors, back into the bunk. But the noises didn't stop. Throughout the night, something kept waking me up. Scratching along the cab, a heavy thud that once sounded like something landing on the catwalk behind the sleeper. The truck rocked more than it should have for just wind. Each time I told myself it was the storm, the branches, the weather. I repeated that explanation so many times it started to sound rehearsed. Morning finally came around 10. The storm had moved on, leaving everything buried in fresh, untouched snow. I climbed into the driver's seat, poured some coffee from my thermos, lit a cigarette, and let the fog in my head start to clear. That's when I noticed it. Directly across the 2-lane highway, spreading up a small hill, sat an old cemetery, the kind from the 1800s. crooked headstones leaning at tired angles, a wrought iron fence sagging and broken in places, snow clinging to the markers like white shrouds. I just stared at it. I'm not a superstitious guy, never have been, but the night replayed itself in my mind. I stepped out to do my pre-trip, and the first thing I checked were those tree limbs. In daylight, they weren't even close. They were higher and farther from the cab than they'd looked in the dark. Walked around with the flashlight. No walked around with the flashlight. No footprints leading up to the driver's door. No tracks beside the cab. Nothing on the catwalk. Just mine. The back of my neck tightened. The kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. I finished my pre-trip faster than usual. Didn't take my time. Didn't look twice at that cemetery again. I got in the truck and pulled out of there without a second thought. Now, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts. I don't mess with Ouija boards or any of that. But I will swear on my father's grave that those knocks were real. The scraping was real. And nothing in that snow, nothing living, was responsible for it. Take it however you want. I just know I didn't sleep the rest of that run. The ghost in the tow lot. About 15 years ago, back when I was still running my old Kenworth, I used to park overnight in the back lot of a towing company just outside of town. It wasn't much to look at. Gravel, chain-link fencing, wrecked vehicles lined up like forgotten headstones. But it was quiet, and quiet is worth a lot when you live on the road. One full morning, around 4:30 a.m., I was outside doing my pre-trip inspection. The engine was idling low, coughing out white exhaust into the cold air. It was still dark, that deep, heavy kind of darkness that settles just before dawn, the kind that makes everything look slightly unreal. That's when I noticed him. He came walking up from the direction of the impound lot. A kid, maybe 20 years old, thin, pale. His t-shirt was ripped and filthy, his jeans caked with dirt. Even in the dim light, I could see dark stains across his shirt. At first, I thought it was oil, but the longer I looked, the more it didn't look like oil at all. I asked him if he was okay. He nodded calmly. Too calmly. Then he asked if I could give him a ride to a town about 10 miles west. I told him I couldn't. I was heading northeast and already on a tight schedule. Trucking doesn't leave much room for detours. He didn't argue. He just said, almost absent-mindedly, "They brought my car in last night." He turned and pointed behind me. I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, a white car sitting in the lot, completely destroyed. The roof crushed, the body twisted like it had been wrung out. It looked like it had rolled more than once. I couldn't even tell what make or model it used to be. When I looked back at him, he was staring at it, not with shock, not with anger, just blank. Then he turned and walked away. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was the stains on his shirt. Maybe it was the silence. I suddenly felt bad for turning him down. So I stepped around the front of my truck to call him back, ready to tell him I'd give him the ride after all. But he was gone. Not halfway to the building. Not by the wrecked car. Gone. There was nowhere he could have disappeared to in those few seconds. I even yelled out that I'd take him. No answer, just the sound of my engine idling in the dark. A few hours later, I got a call from a buddy of mine, a volunteer firefighter from a town just south of where that kid said he needed to go. He asked if I'd seen the car they towed in overnight. I told him I had, the white one that rolled. Before I could say anything else, he sighed and said, "Yeah, that was a bad one." Young kid from the town 10 miles west. Fell asleep, missed a curve, didn't survive. I didn't tell him about the boy who asked me for a ride. I never saw that kid again. But every time I parked in that lot, I'd glance over at that wrecked white car. And every time I did, I felt the same thing settle over me. Dread. Like someone was still waiting for a ride that would never come. When they finally hauled that car away a few weeks later, I remember feeling relieved, because some things don't belong sitting around in the dark, and some passengers were never meant to be picked up. The story ends here, but the terror does not. Join me again, like, comment, and subscribe if you dare.